I'm going to ask Reverend Holly Hill Thompson, who will be the next panelist, and then Tila Travis will be also presenting. Holly.
Okay, thank you, Carmen. Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Pat, and thank you, Carla. You have shared such important informations that the Presbyterian Church often has not ever heard. So they're hearing this for the first time. I would like to go through these very quickly. I will do talking not perhaps about each slide that you see, but I want to help communicate images to which we can refer later and in future events, because we will be having more and more discussions about how it is we are to be neighbors. And as a Shinnecock woman, when I pray Mikwanta Sheyean Kusukoyu. And just in reclaiming those words is a way of saying that our people had a relationship with the Creator and all of creation around us, and it was sacred and it was balanced. And I have depicted here Noadana and Massasoit, both male leaders, but in the middle is the image of a clan mother. And in matrilineal societies, it was the clan mother who chose or disposed of chiefs, if a chief was worthy or if a chief was unworthy. And that is a whole way of life that was completely disregarded by the settlers who came into a place where there was balance and harmony with nature and with the human beings. And they brought something that they thought was divine in and of itself. They thought that it was their responsibility, their duty, their gift to come and erase whatever it is they saw and did not understand, to supplant their own ways. A brand of Christianity that has no respect for human beings or for the earth or for the varieties that the Creator has provided. And that is in every species, in different kinds of human beings, in different tribal nations, in different plants, in different, all over creation. And these ways are thousands of years old. And yet, the wisdom of women leadership has still not been fully appreciated by those who have come in the 15 and 1600s. This doctrine of discovery was, in a modern term, like a blank check. A blank check. Go to anywhere in the world, do whatever you wish to do to the people who happen to be there. For they are no more than, Chief Oren Lyon says, they are as a deer or a rabbit. Place that we lived in peace together, completely impacted and decimated by the brand of Christianity that was spawned from, which spawned the doctrine of discovery. I always show pictures of Gadali, Kateri Tekawita. We know that it is a pattern when colonizing and conquering nations try to pick out one or two. Oh, this person will represent their race. I put this one on because this Native woman, she was finally canonized. And so there are people who are Native and who appreciate that. But please see that one of the reasons they say she came to the attention of the whites was because upon her death, her face turned white. And so they said that was a sign of her divinity. Samson Occam, of course, the first Native American ordained in East Hampton, just miles from Shinnecock territory, and in East Hampton Presbyterian Church. And his relationship with the denomination and with the whites did not grow and was a happy and productive one. He was resented because he took the side of justice of his Native people and could communicate and had access to the Presbyterians and other white settlers who was who were taking his people's lands and cheating Native people. And our ways of life were intergenerational and communal. Our ways of life had value and respect. And these two quotes, one, Red Jacket telling a missionary, we'll wait and see if your Christianity has a good effect on the white people before we think of it ourselves. If it makes the white people more civilized, maybe we'll listen to what you have to say. And then, of course, our dear Katie Cannon, whose field was ethics, first African-American woman ordained in a Presbyterian church, she had come to the conclusion that the ethics of the dominator and the ethics of those dominated are not the same and cannot be reconciled. There is reasonably resistance to any sort of church participation when we find that it was not something that was concerned with our souls and with our peace and with our justice and with our faith, but it was concerned with taking our land and assimilating Native people, not recognizing that we had learned ways to live in peace together, that the biblical folk only talk about. I let this picture speak for itself. The doctrine of discovery was that blank check to bless and allow all of this violence to happen. And of course, we know that it continues in many ways, even though some of these things are no longer legal, they are still spawning behaviors and different kinds of ideologies based on a Christianity that is allowed to do what it will with indigenous people or non-white people. I always show this one because Shivington was the United Methodist who led the Sand Hill massacre in Colorado. Washington and Jackson, called great by white America, both of whom were called killers of Indians for valid reasons, the effects of which are still felt today. Before May of 2021, this 13-year silence about a moment of silence for Indigenous children in residential and boarding schools, similar to what Miss Suzanne just said of the Thomas Indian School, Hampton, and Carlisle Indian School. But then, of course, we found that there are at least 6,500 undocumented and sometimes unmarked burials. Reverend Sid Bird, Presbyterian minister, would tell his story of being taken from his home at 6 years old and the experience when he finally returning to his grandparents was unable to speak to them in his own language because of the experience of the boarding school. And these orange shirts, Orange Shirt Day, September 30th, is representing all of the children whose lives and whose childhood and whose future was taken from them through residential and boarding schools, which were church-sponsored and government-sponsored, committing cultural and spiritual and physical genocide. We will be learning much more about this because sadly the numbers are growing. I think the doctrine of discovery shows what Dr. John Dominic Crossan talks about, a genocidal germ in the kind of thinking that is fundamentalism, that thinks that if one group has the only and absolute truth, they can do whatever it is they please because they own that truth, and how dangerous that kind of Christianity is. I included this picture because this came during 2020, and one of our young people went down and enhanced the sign that is just feet from our reservation. It's in our face every day that the South Hamilton has this wonderful history, and yet here we are. I reviewed just last night poverty standards for the Shinnecock community because the Poor People's Campaign asked me for the latest, and I became emotional just reading our statistics and how in the 1990s and early 2000s, our people were at 50% poverty level. Now it went to 60%, and now it's as high as 66% of the Shinnecock people are living at and below poverty. And this is in one of the wealthiest communities in the world, and that is the Hamptons. And yes, there are Presbyterians sitting on sacks of money and stolen land in the Hamptons. And that is why we want to have a conversation, because 1640 was 380 years ago, and the Indians are not going to disappear no matter how many denominations or governments or towns or villages wish that to be so. The land owns us. We belong to our land. We are related to our land. Our communities are caretakers of our land, and our DNA is in our land. And we will survive even through all of the traumas that come to us. We're learning more about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirits. Those are things we have to talk about. The orange shirt and the residential and boarding schools, things we have to talk about. The history of our meeting was to be peaceful. The two-row wampum is from 1613, and that was an agreement to live side by side in peace. And we know that the Dutch and other Europeans did not keep that. And there is still a chance. I'll go by her. She thought she was going to make a contribution to the Presbyterian Church. She's still waiting. But just lately, and Tila might touch on this, but 4.5 acres have finally been returned to the stewardship of the Shinnecock people. It was the top of Sugarloaf Hill, where ancient burials, no matter how the whites have tried since 1859 to remove us from that land, our burials and people are still found in that place. And we will fight against grave desecration, and we will fight for our 3,600 acres to be returned to us. Land back has begun in the Hamptons, no matter what else our neighbors think. And this is one of my chosen daughters, and she sees me doing all this writing and presenting everything having to do with the church and with non-native people. And she just said this to me: how can non-natives think this is all too horrible to even talk about when we have been living through this nightmare of trauma for generations? And so out of the mouths of babes. But I thank you for your attention, and I entrust these words now and our future conversations to your hearts and minds. Tabene.